Coulda, shoulda, woulda. Words of the great Jim Mora. I encourage you to check out his rants on YouTube. But anyways, that quote applies to a ton of sports teams that you look at and think, damn, how did they not win a title? Teams that fell victim to bad circumstances or bad officiating are this guy right here. You only have so few opportunities in the sport to create your legend. These teams somehow didn't. What's happening, YouTube captives? And welcome to Dan on Sports. Today we'll be looking at 10 such teams that we can't believe didn't win a title during their run. And now for the criteria. This is not a top 10 list. It's 10 teams in roughly chronological order. We're not looking at one specific year, but the overall time that the team and the coaching staff was together and their body of work during that time. Not including the Laker or Celtic teams of the 80s, because those teams were beating each other. And as for the current Suns team, which I have to mention since, they inspired this list, they won't be listed here. Their story of failure is still being told. Give it time, people. Besides, I already have the Suns on here twice. Now on to the list. Up first, the Phoenix Suns of the early to mid-90s. This was a high-octane team that blazed through the Western Conference under the late Paul Westphal. Led by your favorite TNT personality and former league MVP Charles Barkley, the Suns were an offensive juggernaut that remained as one of the top teams in the West for a number of years. Along with Barkley, there was the talented Kevin Johnson, role player Danny Ainge, and home run hitter Dan Marley. I mean, just look at this casual long-range shot. He was doing it long before Curry made it popular. Suns made it all the way to the finals during Barkley's MVP season, but they ran into the Bulls and a very angry Michael Jordan, who apparently didn't take too kindly to the MVP snub and wanted to take it out on Barkley. Jordan averaged 41 points per game, including a 55-point explosion in Game 4, but it was John Paxson who did them in with a season-ending three-pointer that dashed the Suns' hopes. The next 2 years, the Suns were eliminated by the eventual back-to-back champions, the Houston Rockets, losing in 7 both times. The Suns never recovered. Up next, the New York Knicks of the early 90s, mid-90s, and late 90s, I guess. Legendary coach Pat Riley, Hall of Famer Patrick Ewing, best defense in the league and a home court that was a nightmare to play in. You'd think the Knicks would have had a title or two, right? Wrong. The 90s were a fun time to be a dominant center, with the likes of Olajuwon, O'Neal, Robinson, and Ewing. The post-game was never more on display than it was back then. The Knicks were a top team in the East for the better part of the decade, but no team was better than that 93 team. That team was built to win a title, but unfortunately they ran into that Jordan fellow. Get used to seeing him on this list. He crushed a ton of championship dreams. Aww. The Knicks blew a 2-0 series lead and lost to the Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals. In 94, after Jordan's first of 300 retirements, the Knicks made it to the finals, but lost in 7 to the Houston Rockets. They were up 3-2 and had 2 opportunities to win it all, but wasn't happening, man. The Knicks were a good team throughout the rest of the decade, but could never quite get back to that form. Yes, that 98-99 team did go to the finals, but they had no chance against that Spurs juggernaut. Up next, we have the mid-90s Orlando Magic. Unless you're my age or older, or like to Google old shit, you probably didn't know that before he was winning titles with the Los Angeles Lakers, Shaq suffered through some tough L's in Orlando. The Magic was a young team on the come-up, and when Penny joined, the team was, it was like magic. Shaq and Penny was Shaq and Kobe before Shaq and Kobe was Shaq and Kobe. They were an exciting team to watch, and were actually good enough to get to the NBA Finals. Then came the infamous Nick Anderson free throw attempts, and the Magic never recovered. They lost to the Rockets in 4, but the future was bright. They were fresh off of eliminating Jordan from the playoffs in 95. But that was a returning from retirement Michael Jordan, a rusty Michael Jordan. And Jordan's known for holding grudges. With a full season, Jordan got back in basketball shape and swept the Magic the following year. That was it for the Magic. They never got back in championship contention. Shaq went to LA, Penny started breaking down prematurely, and that was that. Up next, we have the Seattle Supersonics of the early to mid 90s. So before they were the Oklahoma City Thunder, more on them later, they were the Seattle Supersonics. The Supersonics were a top team in the West in the early to mid 90s, winning 60 plus games several times. With George Karl at the helm, the glove Gary Payton at the point, and the athletic as F Shawn Kemp, the Sonics were a team to keep an eye on. But man, did they have their share of follies. Back when the first round was a best of 5 series, the 1 seed Sonics blew a 2-0 series lead to the 8th seed Denver Nuggets in a moment that still warms my cold heart to this day. The Sonics remained contenders for the next few years, but man, did they pick the wrong year to get to the finals. You guessed it, Jordan's back. Fresh off of winning 72 games and losing only 1 playoff game, the Bulls jumped to a 3-0 series lead. The Sonics did win the next 2 to make it interesting, but it was never in any doubt. Seattle never got that deep again. Kemp went to Cleveland, got out of shape, and with his game being predicated on athleticism, became utterly useless. Payton eventually found his way to Los Angeles and went back to the finals, only to get dominated by Detroit in a gentleman's sweep. The Sonics moved to OKC in the late 2000s. Up next, we have the 90s Utah Jazz, in particular mid-90s. If you're young and read about the exploits of Stockton and Malone, you probably thought that they won a title. But nope, they never did. In a town with the most misnamed team, well, since the Lakers, the team found much success in the 90s under the leadership of the late Jerry Sloan. The team was steadily improving year by year until they were good enough to get to the NBA Finals, and they did it in back-to-back years. Unfortunately, they ran into you-know-who. Karl Malone was fresh off of winning MVP. In the Western Conference Finals, they eliminated the Rockets with this game winner from Stockton to punch their ticket to the finals. They were battle-tested and hungry, giving the Bulls all they could handle. It took several game winners from Jordan, including one in the legendary flu game, which apparently was a bad pizza game, and another game winner from Golden State head coach Steve Kerr. The Bulls won in 6, with most of the games being close. Utah bounced back the next year with the best record in the league. Their path to the finals was much easier this time around, as they made short work of the Lakers in a 4-game sweep. The Jazz were actually favored this time by many people versus the Bulls, who just got out of a tough 7-game series against the Pacers that went the distance. With home court advantage versus the Bulls, the Jazz won Game 1 in overtime, but lost the next 3. Took Game 5, and then this happened. Utah never recovered. Up next, the early 2000s Portland Trailblazers. This was a well put together squad. They went 35-15 in a strike-shortened year and got to the Western Conference Finals, losing to the eventual champion San Antonio Spurs in a sweep. The Spurs dominated that year with a healthy David Robinson and an emerging Tim Duncan. In the 99-2000 season, the Los Angeles Lakers and the Portland Blazers dominated the Western Conference and appeared to be on a collision course. That collision took place in the Western Conference Finals. Portland was led by talented forward and resident hothead Rasheed Wallace, along with a Scottie Pippen in decline but still pretty good, as well as Steve Smith and Arvydas Sabonis, whose son is now playing in the league. The team was coached by Mike Dunleavy. They won 59 games and posed a real threat to the Lakers, but it was LA that came out swinging, jumping to a 3-1 series lead. Portland won the next 2 to force Game 7, where they had a double-digit fourth quarter lead before the Lakers came back and won the game, capped off by this Kobe alley to Shaq. The Blazers would win roughly 50 games a year the next 3 seasons, but never made it out of the first round. They had a very small window and could not get past 2 legendary coaches. Up next, we have the Sacramento Kings of the early 2000s. This might low-key be the best team on this list. With how long the Kings have been bad, you'd forget that they were on the cusp of bumping the Lakers. And with how inferior the Eastern Conference was at the time, they would have been on the cusp of winning the championship. This was a talented and synergistic team, everyone feeding off each other. Chris Webber was a legit star, Peja Stojakovic was balling out of his mind, and Mike Bibby was playing the best basketball of his life. They won 50 plus games every year from 2000 to 2005. They peaked in 2002 when they had the Lakers on the ropes. But Phil Jackson coached teams are supposed to three-peat, so in order to protect the space-time continuum, the referees had to step in. What heroes. Now, I don't like to blame refs for shit, but we know Donaghy wasn't lying. Look at his forearm right in the line of sight of the referee. The Lakers survived that Game 6 and then took Game 7, which the Kings definitely should blame themselves for, going 16 for 30 from the line. The next year they were bumped by the Mavericks in 7, and then by the Timberwolves again in 7. Their window was now closed, but for a brief few years, that was a damn good basketball team. Up next, the Phoenix Suns of the mid to 2000s and partially in the 2010s, I guess. Guess who's back? Back again. Steve Nash returned to the team that drafted him in 2004, and the Suns took off, under coach Mike D'Antoni, whose internal shot clock is 7 seconds or less. With the development of Amari Stoudemire and the Matrix Shawn Marion, Nash's job got a whole lot easier than it did in Dallas. His assist numbers skyrocketed, and the Suns became one of the most potent offenses in recent memory. They won an NBA Best 62 games in the first year, but lost in the conference finals to the Spurs. Steve Nash won MVP that year, and won it the next year as well, but lost to the Mavericks in the conference finals. They lost again to the Spurs in a controversial series that saw Ori knock Steve Nash into an alternate universe, and Stoudemire gets suspended for leaving the bench, an idiotic rule that still exists to this day. They got all they could out of this team under D'Antoni, and he was replaced by a more defensive-minded Terry Porter, and then by Alvin Gentry. They actually swept the Spurs this time around and competed hard in the Western Conference Finals, but lost to Kobe and the Lakers in 6. And that was it for that Suns team. Amari and his uninsured knees eventually went to the Knicks, and Nash was picked up in a sign and trade by the Lakers. Hard to imagine that this team didn't win a title, but those pesky Spurs got him every time. And when you actually look at it, they pretty much lost to the eventual champions just about almost every year that they were considered a top contender. Up next, the 2010s Oklahoma City Thunder. It's crazy to think that at one time OKC had Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden. They had a super team before anyone even realized it. Before they even realized it. 3 young talents growing together. The Thunder steadily developed until they finally made it to the NBA Finals after dropping the Spurs in 6 games in 2012. They went head to head with the Miami Heat and their big 3. A year after coming up short versus the Mavericks, the pressure and the heat was on the Heat. That pressure and anxiety went up faster than you checking your work email after a week off when Miami lost Game 1. The Heat responded by winning the next 4 and taking the title. The belief was that the Thunder would be back as they're still a pretty young team. They were the second youngest team ever in the finals. They should have many years of deep playoff runs in them, right? Well, kind of. After trading away Harden, they lost in the semis to the Grizzlies in 5, and then in the conference finals to the Spurs in 6 the following year. They failed to make the playoffs in 2015, but in 2016, they almost made history. They had the 73-win Golden State Warriors on the ropes with a 3-1 series lead with back-to-back blowout wins. The Warriors had no answers initially, but they damn sure found them. The Warriors won the remaining 3 games, all by single digits, and that was that. Durant couldn't beat them, so he joined them, signing in the offseason and leaving Westbrook by himself to do all the stat chasing he ever wanted to do. The run was over. Up next, the late 2010s Houston Rockets. Speaking of Harden, the run with the Rockets was supposed to go much more differently than it did. But like the great philosopher Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan till they get punched in the mouth. And punched in the mouth they did get. But before that, Chris Paul was traded to Houston in 2017, and the Rockets' fortunes changed immediately. They won 65 games and went on to the Western Conference Finals versus Golden State. With the series tied at 2 apiece, they won Game 5 to take a 3-2 lead on the Warriors, but right on schedule, Chris Paul pulls a hammy. James Harden was not enough as the Rockets lost Game 6 and 7. They would lose it next year in the semis to their yearly tormentors. The Warriors ended up eliminating them 4 times in 5 years. This was a team that was put together to win now, and they did not win now. They had all the talent in the world to do so, they just failed, man. Is this your point, God? Eventually, Harden gets fat and gets traded to the Nets, and then the Sixers, where he continued to lack the testicular fortitude to carry the team and does his usual disappearing act in elimination games. Chris Paul finds himself in Phoenix, where he might be on my next list. To be continued. And there's our list. Thanks for tuning in. Do you agree with the teams listed here? Do you disagree? Do you think you know more NBA than I do? Prove it in the comments below, of course. If you like this content, feel free to like, share, subscribe. Feel free to say what's up on my social media listed to my right. So until next time, you're dismissed. Peace.